class. I am so sorry I could not be there this week. My name is Erin Schwind. I will be your instructor. I had a business conference take me out of the Mobile area for the entire week. So this was the best way for me to deliver you the information without either keeping you longer for another class, which no one wants, or making you do a lot of extra work and try to teach yourself, which no one wants either. So hopefully this isn't too awful for you to sit through because it's kind of what you're going to do for the next 8 weeks, but just in class instead of at your computer. But anyways, we're going to go over this syllabus real quick, and then we're going to jump into the lecture. And on your Blackboard, you can find all the PowerPoints for all 6 lectures. They're already up there. My suggestion is to always print them off, bring them to class, and as we're going over them, you can make notes in the margins of the PowerPoint. She said this was important, highlight, star, this is going to be on the test. Extra information that I provide, because not everything on the slide is everything you need to know. You need to know a little bit more than that. So that's my suggestion. Print them out, bring them to class. So before you go any further, go on Blackboard, print off PowerPoint 1 so that as we are going through this lecture, you can make notes and changes to those, or not changes, but additions to those PowerPoints. Also, you'll need your syllabus because we're going to go over that. Awesome. So without any further ado, let's go over the syllabus and the main points that you need to know from that. It's also on your Blackboard. It's under course. It's under syllabus. PowerPoints are under course content. All your assignments, which we'll go over, will be under assignments. Everything's on Blackboard. So if you jump to page 3 of the syllabus, the first 2 pages are just kind of standard purpose, course objectives. If you really want to know all the nitty-gritty details about that, fantastic. Feel free to read through it. But what you want to know, and what I know you want to know, first thing is the textbook. There is a textbook for the course. It is America, A Narrative History, the 9th edition, Volume 1. Volume 1 is American First Half, which is what we're covering this course, up to Reconstruction. So make sure if you do purchase it, purchase Volume 1. What I always tell everyone, all my students, is the textbook is optional. If I do not cover it in class, if it's not talked about in class, you're not tested on it. So if you print out the PowerPoints, you come to class, you take notes, you should do fine. However, I have had some students in the past who have preferred to purchase the book because they know they're going to miss class, or they know that they just need that extra information. They want that security of having the book to refer to follow along with, to make notes in the margins of the textbook, anything like that. Perfectly fine if you want to purchase it. However, like I said, it's not necessary. There's no readings from the book that are mandatory. There's no homework straight from the book. There's no quizzes over the book or anything like that. Once again, it's what is discussed in class, which makes attendance very important, because if you miss class, you miss part of class, you're missing what's being discussed in class. And that's what you're tested on. But anyways, textbook information, page 3, if you are interested in purchasing it. The next section, section 6 on the syllabus, on page 3, it says course requirements and evaluation. There are, it's a hybrid course, so we will meet in class, except this week and one other week, which I'll talk about when I get back. But we'll meet in class, we'll have lecture, we'll take exams, and then out of class you will have assignments as well. Let's talk about your in-class assignments. There are 2 formal examinations in this course, a midterm and a final exam. They are taken in class. You will take your midterm on week 4, and then your final exam, obviously, the last day. Each exam covers class material, what's discussed in lecture, what's covered in reading prompts, what you're quizzed over, what's on the PowerPoints. Like I said, attendance is super, super important. Don't be late. Don't leave early. It's important. Each exam is worth 350 points out of a total of 1,000 points. So each exam is 35% of your grade. So midterm and final exam each total make up 70% of your final grade. So they're kind of important. Exams are not allowed to be made up. Again, make-up exams not allowed unless you have a very extreme circumstance with proper documentation for that. You're in the hospital. Your child is in the hospital. Something like that. It's got to be very extreme circumstance. And if you want to make up the exam, it must be done within 1 week of the midterm exam. 1 week. So no emailing me 3 weeks after the exam and saying I want to make up my midterm. I have, you know, whatever your excuse was. No. Be there. You know the schedule. Starts on page 4. So you know the schedule. You know when the midterm is going to be. You know when the final is going to be. Make sure you attend those days. Because, like I said, makeup exams must have a very extreme circumstance to do that. And you have to make it up within 1 week. On top of the exams, you will have 6 quizzes. These are done on Blackboard. They are open note, open PowerPoint, open book if you have it, and you have 1 hour to take it. Each week on Wednesday, your quizzes will go live about 8 p.m. And then they are due, listen, Tuesday at midnight. So the Tuesday before class at midnight, your quizzes are due and they close. And you cannot make up these quizzes. So you have 1 week to take them. And once you start the quiz, you have to finish it. So don't wait until 11 o'clock on Tuesday, 11 o'clock at night on Tuesday to take the exam. Because if your computer crashes or it skips out on you or freezes or whatever, I can't do anything about it. And I'm not going to have any sympathy for that. So make sure you schedule your time wisely to take this quiz. Because like if your computer does freeze, if it does crashes, you can email me and I will reset your quiz. I'll let you finish it. But like I said, if you wait till the last minute and I'm already in bed or I just am not checking my email that night, you're kind of out of luck. So make sure that you take it early enough in the week so if something does happen, you have time to get it reset. Also, if you don't attend class, you're still responsible for taking this quiz. You know it's going to happen. 8 p.m. on Wednesday, it's going live. You have until midnight on Tuesday to get it done. Schedule your time wisely, whether you're going to be in class or not. You're still responsible for taking it. Each quiz is worth 25 points, and there are 6 of them, like I said. Also, each week you will have writing prompts. There are 6 of those as well, and they are also worth 25 points. They will also go live Wednesday at 8 p.m., and you have until midnight on Tuesday to turn them in as well. They're not timed. What they are is you're going to have a series of questions to answer, and you're going to have to read a primary source to answer those questions. And I provide all of that on Blackboard. Your answers need to be in paper format. Do not put 1 and then an incomplete sentence. Say the question is, what is Charles's understanding of how Native Americans should be handled? I don't want you to say 1, very severely, they are not human. It needs to be in a paper format. It needs to have paragraphs. It needs to have transitions. It needs to be a well thought out response. So, writing prompts online, quizzes online. They're both due midnight on Tuesday. Yeah. Then other than that, the informal assessment component of the course is if you have a borderline grade at the end of the module, I go back, I look at your attendance, I look at did she or he turn everything in. If you're constantly late or constantly leaving, I notice. Don't think it doesn't go without any awareness, I notice. That goes into effect on how I calculate your final grade. So just keep all that in mind. Also, I expect students to be prompt. So please, class starts at 6. Please be there at 6. And it doesn't end until I'm done lecturing. So don't leave early. Now, if you do have some sort of emergency coming up, or you're expecting an emergency phone call or something like that, let me know. I'm happy to work with you. I'm happy if you do need to leave early one night out of the whole module because whatever reason, that's fine. Let me know before class starts. Just say, hey, I need to leave early, you know, for whatever your reason is. I'll work with you on that. Just always keep me in the loop. That's the big thing. Something happens and you miss class and whatever, just keep me in the loop. That's all I ask. Just open communication. All right, like I said, total, the class is worth 1,000 points. The quizzes and the writing prompts make up 30% of your grade. The midterm and final exam is 70% of your grade. So it's very important that you do all of those things because not doing any writing prompts or not taking any quizzes, it's 15% of your grade. Like, it's going to hurt you. So just make sure you do everything. The next thing on the syllabus is the course calendar. This tells you exactly what we're going to talk about each week. If you do have the book, what chapters we're going to be covering, and what assignments you're expected to do that week. So this is something important for you to constantly reference each week to make sure that you're staying on task. And also so that the midterm and final exam don't sneak up on you. I've had students show up and be like, I didn't realize you're taking a midterm today. Yes, it's on the syllabus. You know from day one exactly when everything is. It's all right here. So please put this on your fridge, highlight it. It goes on the second page. Yes, important. The last page of the syllabus is probably the most important information. My contact information, how to email me if your computer crashes or freezes and you need your quiz reset or you have a question on anything. Contact information, syllabus right there, last page. And then my policies. The first one, academic dishonesty in any form will not be tolerated. And I mean this. If you copy and paste from a website for your writing prompt and turn that in, you get a 0. No ifs, ands, or buts. Even if it's just a portion of your writing prompt that you copy and paste from a website, you will get a 0. So don't do it. Don't research the internet for whatever topic the writing prompt is on. Don't do it. Just read the primary source I provide you and answer the questions in your own words. Then everybody will be happy. I don't tolerate academic dishonesty. So just don't do it. Don't do it. Second, cell phones. Please, when we have class, turn them off or silence them. If you are expecting an emergency phone call, you can turn it on vibrate, put it on the table. It'll be fine. You'll see it light up. You'll hear it vibrate. It's just very discourteous when cell phones go off. It's discourteous to me. It's discourteous to your fellow students who are trying to listen to the lecture and pay attention and learn. So just for everyone's sake, silence them or turn them off, either way. Students are expected to attend class regularly and to be prompt. Like I said, leaving early, coming late, that's a distraction. It's also very discourteous and rude to both myself and your fellow peers. So please be on time. I do understand that sometimes traffic gets in the way. There's a big wreck. Sometimes, you know, the person who's supposed to relieve you shows up late. I understand all this. So if you're running late, don't think you can't show up, but just don't do it every week. Don't make it a habit. If it's a one-time thing, it's cool. If it's a second time, after that, it affects your grade. So just be on time and don't leave early. That's all I ask. Also, there is a Faulkner policy that you can't miss more than 2 classes. After that, you automatically fail the course. I can't do anything about it. So please don't just say, oh, I don't want to show up today. It's raining really hard outside. Because you don't know if another family emergency, or your car breaks down, or something's going to happen where you can't attend class. Once you make that third absence, like I said, I can't do anything. So just be very mindful of your attendance. And then the last 2 points are covering your quiz and exam. Your quiz, 60 minutes. Once you start it, you have to finish it. They're due by midnight on Tuesday. They cannot be made up. Once they're closed, they're closed. You have an entire week to take them. So can't make it up. Schedule your time wisely to do that. Exams, they start promptly. After 6:15, I close and I lock the door. And I don't care who you are, you're not taking the exam if you show up late. So you know the schedule when right there. When the midterm exam is, when the final exam is. So on those 2 days, out of all 8, make sure you are on time. 6:15, door is locked, closed, and ain't no one taking that exam after 6:15. Very hard on that. So be there on time. Also, exam makeups for exams are not permitted unless a very extreme circumstance where you have proper documentation. And if you do fit that criteria, you have to make it up within that 1 week before the next class period. So you've got 1 week. Okay, that is the syllabus. If you have any questions, you can either ask me next week in class or you can email me. I'll be happy to answer any of those questions. So please let me know, either, like I said, in class or email me. So we are now going to go to the lecture and cover that information. So I'm going to pull up, let me share my screen with you. There we go. And we're going to pull this up. Awesome. And then let's go this way. So here's the PowerPoint. This is what it should look like when you have it and print it off. And so we're going to cover, this entire class covers pre-contact all the way through Reconstruction. So tonight we're going to talk about Native Americans, what was going on in America before Europeans arrived, and then what happened when Europeans decided to come this way, and why did they decide to come this way. All right. So there were approximately 10 million Native Americans on the American continent before Europeans arrived. As you can see from this map, you can see the breakdown of the groupings of tribes, whether they were hunters and gatherers or agricultural based or fishing focused. They were all over. They were all over America. However, in the 15th century, so in the 1400s, there were improvements to technologies that led to the construction of bigger ships. They were able to cross oceans. They were able to go across these large swaths of water. And what these new ships did is they spawned an ambition to explore new territories, to go beyond the horizon and find out what's going on out there. And it also fueled a desire to acquire wealth, to build commerce, and to spread Christianity throughout the world. So while we're going out there and exploring, why not try and find items that we can harvest and sell? Why not find trade routes or other countries we can do trade with? And then if we come across any natives or anyone not Christian, let's change their faith. That was the main goal. The two main people, the two main explorers that we are going to focus on are Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You've probably heard that little rhyme. But he set sail for Asia in 92, and he reached the Bahamas, Cuba, and Haiti. So he didn't quite reach Asia because there was this large body of land in between Asia and Europe that nobody knew about. However, Columbus believed he had reached the Indies right outside of Asia, so he started thinking that he had reached close to Asia. He didn't recognize that he had discovered, he had stumbled across a whole new continent. He didn't understand that. So he started calling all the natives there Indians, because he believed he had reached the Indies. And that's why we now say Indians. But it wasn't until 1499 when Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci landed on the coast of South America, and he recognized that this was an entirely new continent. This was not Asia. This was not Eastern Europe. It was an entire new world. And so after his discovery and understanding, European map makers began labeling the quote-unquote new world using a variation of his name, America. So that's why we call them Indians, and that's why we are known as North and South America. By the mid-1500s, the success of Catholic Spain in conquering and exploiting much of the Western Hemisphere, including Portugal, France, and England, and parts of the Netherlands, they started developing their own imperial claims. So all of the England, you can see where England started exploring. All the pink areas is where they started going. You can see all the areas that France started exploring. They took the rivers through the central part of North America. You can see the areas where Spain started exploring, your Caribbean, Latin America, your western coast of the South America, and then Portugal hit up pretty much Brazil and that part of South America. So you can see these four nations, England, France, Spain, and Portugal, started competing for these new territories, started competing for possession of these new lands and all the raw materials that they could acquire from these lands. And in 1588, Britain defeated the Spanish Armada, and this is what began the global dominance of England in this exploration, particularly North America. By beating out Spain, that meant that the only other country they kind of had to compete with was France for North America. But this is one of the predominant reasons. This defeat of the Spanish Armada is why we speak predominantly English rather than Spanish as our native language. So Britain began focusing on exploring and then also colonizing parts of North America. And while doing this, every decision they made, every reason they decided to come and colonize was rooted in this British tradition of liberty that began 300 years before this. In 1215, the Magna Carta was signed, which established the principle that the people had basic rights, including equality before the law. So no matter what your level of income was, whether you were within the inner circle of the king's court or whether you were a pauper, you had equality before the law. It was part of your rights as a citizen of the England of Great Britain. It also gave the power to tax to Parliament. So it established this understanding of the role government plays in maintaining an income for the government. And this tradition of liberty ended up inspiring British capitalism that led for the creation of for-profit joint stock companies. And this is what's important for the colonies. What are joint stock companies? Well, they're private companies that are not owned or mandated by the government. The government plays no role in them. They don't monitor them or somehow figure out how to manage the company. It's a private company. And the people who purchase into this stock for this company, they shared the risks and the profits of maritime exploration and colonial settlement. So the people who buy into this company, who own a percentage of the company by purchasing stock, they're the ones that are financially at risk whether this exploration to the colonies is a success or not. If it's a failure, they lose all their money. If it's a success, they can possibly exponentially increase the income that they're getting. So what this shows, what this creation of the joint stock company coming out of this British tradition of liberty, is that the British colonies in America began not as initiatives undertaken by the monarchy, which was the case in Spain and Portugal. They were all monarchy-driven explorations, but rather they began as profit-seeking corporations that were purely going to America looking for a way to make money, whether that be through finding a raw material that they can then send back to the markets in Great Britain and turn into some sort of product, or maybe they can find gold or silver that they can immediately have an income off of. And the first joint stock company in 1606 was the Virginia Company. It was chartered by King James, but it was a joint stock enterprise. It was privately owned, privately managed. Even though the king initially wanted this company to go out to America as a religious mission to convert Native Americans to Christianity. But remember, it's a joint stock company. The monarchy has no say in what they do and how they run their company. So the stockholders said, you know, that's great. We love that you want to convert these Native Americans, but, you know, we want to make money. So the stockholders said, we're going to America because we want to find gold and other products to help boost our own pocketbooks. But King, it's good for you because if we come back with these items, gold and other products, it'll help England become less dependent upon other nations, particularly Spain, to create these materials. We don't have to purchase them from Spain anymore because we have now found an outlet that we can get it from ourselves. So that's how they sold it to the king, and kind of the king, even though he had no ability to mandate what the Virginia Company did, they still wanted the king's blessing. And this is how they got it. Yes, we're not going to do exactly what you're wanting to do, but it's still going to benefit you because all those wonderful things that we come back with is going to boost England's power. We're not going to be dependent upon other nations anymore. So in 1607, the first colony was, the first permanent colony was established in North America in Virginia under the name of Jamestown. Only men came to this colony, and the majority were gentlemen or townsmen with specific skills such as candle making or haberdashery, making shoes or hats, or making paper, or making spears or swords. Very specialized skills, not general craftsmen. And the thinking was, well, we need all these people to create these items that are standard back home. We need them to be able to create them in the colonies. So, sounded good to start off with. Didn't work out well in practice. Gentlemen, by definition, the vast majority of the people who did come were gentlemen. had no manual skill, nor could they be expected to work at ordinary labor. It was beneath them to roll up their sleeves and do what needed to get done to make the colony a success. They refused to farm. They refused to build homes, to patch homes, to pick up wherever the colony really needed help. They're gentlemen. It's beneath them. They scorned manual labor. They became dependent upon the Indians to provide them food. Farming is beneath them. And the Indians, it didn't take them long to realize this. And when they recognized that these foreigners were not going to handle their own weight to pitch in and do what needs to get done, that the Indians recognized, if we keep giving them all of our food, we can't feed our own tribes. So the Indians cut off their food supply to the colonists, said no more. And unfortunately, winter came. Worst time for the Indians to say no more food, during the time of the year when nothing grows. And because of that, the colonists found themselves facing disease. They found themselves facing drought, starvation, and death. And of the original 105 colonists during this winter, only 38 survived those first 9 months. And what this did is it caused John Smith, who had been put in charge of the Jamestown colony, to impose strict discipline and force everyone to work or not eat. So I don't care whether you're a gentleman or a laborer. I don't care if you know how to make hats or shoes or belts or scarves or houses. Everyone's got to work together for us to survive, or you just don't get any food. That was what John Smith ended up doing. And in 1609, what his decision allowed the colony to survive, but it was just kind of limping along. So in 1609, the Virginia Company sent more colonists to Jamestown, and this time they included women. Hey, if we put women with the men, maybe that notion to protect and provide will kick in, and these men will do what's necessary because now they have their wives or their daughters or potential wives to think about. That was the thinking, because, you know, women were the reason that everything works so successfully, right? Anyways, and what the company ended up doing, the Virginia Company in Jamestown, they redesigned their government in order to lure new investors and new settlers to North America with the promise of free land after 7 years of labor. And what this does, this decision to redesign the government, it sets into something in motion that is going to have profound impact on the construction of North America that is still being felt today. Their decision to say, we will pay for your voyage from England to Virginia as long as you work for free for 7 years. This movement to indentured servitude impacted the labor of North America. And what sent it further into impact was the recognition that tobacco was a lucrative source of revenue. And John Rolfe recognized this in 1612. So not long after they sent women and more people over to Virginia, not long after they transitioned to indentured servitude. So winter came, tobacco was recognized as a lucrative crop, and all the colonists in Jamestown began planting it and growing it and then exporting it back to Britain. And tobacco became a very profitable crop. However, it's a very labor-intensive crop too. It takes monitoring throughout the year, through the growing season. Harvesting it is pretty difficult. Once you harvest it, you still have to do a lot of labor to it to get it prepared for the market. And then once you've picked your crop, you still have to tend to the land and re-nourish the soil for the next round of crop. So it's a very labor-intensive plant, but it was a very lucrative plant. So more and more planters began purchasing more indentured servants, paying for more people to come from England to North America. And so indentured servitude became the primary source of labor in North America for the British during the 17th century. And the system met a demand for labor, and there were poor economic conditions back in England where there were enough people willing to make this very dangerous voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. So up until about the 1660s, when something happens that we'll talk about next week, up until from teens to 1660, so about 50 years, there was a constant flow of indentured servants making the voyage from England to America. And what this constant flow of indentured servants led to was the creation of the headright system in 1618. And what the headright system said was any Englishman who bought a share in the company and could get to Virginia could have 50 acres on arrival and 50 more acres for every servant he brought. So the more indentured servants you're able to bring to North America, the more land you'll get for free, which means more tobacco you can plant, which means more profit you can have. So this is another way to increase the number of indentured servants, particularly in Virginia. However, there was a problem that occurred as a result of this influx, this constant arrival of indentured servants. This constant stream exerted pressure on available lands. There was only so many lands available for colonists to own, to harvest, to put crops on, whether it was tobacco for profit or just your own crops to eat, corn, wheat, apples, potatoes, whatever you wanted to eat. Because the more the colonists pushed inland, the more they bumped into Native Americans. So there was only so much land available, but there's more and more people arriving. And so there's pressure and there's tension over the availability of this land. Because remember, if you're an indentured servant, after 7 years, you are given your freedom and you are expected to then purchase land and put those things that you've learned as an indentured servant into practice as your own owner, your own businessman. So as a result of the lack of lands, freed servants had to either become tenants or claim the less fertile lands inland, where, like I said, there was this constant clash with Native Americans. So it set up a class conflict between the planters who are paying for the way of these indentured servants over and the now freed indentured servants who either have to become who have to rent property or risk running into Native Americans to purchase property that's not going to create as fertile, as good of a crop, and you'll risk running into Native Americans. In 1619, the first Africans entered the Virginia colony. Some were undoubtedly slaves, but nearly all arrived in the colonies as free people. Some were indentured servants, some became indentured servants, some were slaves who became free. It was a mixture of all of them. The first Africans did not fully arrive in shackles as slaves. There was a mixture of all of them. And all of them, regardless whether they were servant, slave, or free, enjoyed rights that were later denied all blacks in Virginia. Initially, masters perceived slaves in the same way they perceived their indentured servants. So there was no race distinction. There was no even class distinction between a slave and an indentured servant. They perceived them all the same. They expected them to maintain the same standards of conduct. If an indentured servant and a slave did the same infraction, stole a chicken, we'll say, they would be punished the same. There was no distinction between being a slave or an indentured servant during this time, other than an indentured servant was freed after 7 years. Everything else was the same between the two, and they both gave the same care. They both were imbued with the same characteristics of being shiftless, irresponsible, unfaithful, ungrateful, or dishonest. All of those characteristics were applied to both slaves and indentured servants. Like I said, they were seen as the same. Prior to 1660, it would have been difficult to distinguish race prejudice from class prejudice. So rather there being a racial component to labor, there is a class component to labor. Prior to 1660, this is very important. There's not a race component to labor. There is a class component to labor. So the planters see themselves as being superior to anyone who's an indentured servant or slave based on class. And as long as slaves formed an insignificant minority of the labor force, there was a community of interest between the indentured servants and the slaves. They were constantly hanging out together. They were seen as being of the same social class. There wasn't any danger in the minds of planters of indentured servants, so British people hanging out with slaves. There was no distinction. So voluntary indentured servitude accounted for about half of the white settlers in all the colonies outside New England through the mid-17th century. And it wasn't until, the reason it's the mid-17th century is because that is when there was an English Civil War, which sharply reduced the inflow of people from England to America. It cut off, or it didn't cut off, but it minimized that stream of indentured servants coming over. Also, prior to the middle of the 17th century, there was a high death rate among indentured servants. There was a high death rate among all colonists in America. So it didn't make financial sense to purchase someone for the rest of their life, their labor for the rest of their life, because they're not going to live very long. It made more financial sense to invest in an indentured servant because they were cheaper. You only had to pay their passage, and the likelihood of them dying either within their 7 years or just right after their 7 years was high. So financially, it made more sense to go with indentured servants. However, indentured servants began to live longer, and this caused more men and women to become free each year. Remember, there's already a problem over shortage of availability of land, and now they're living longer, and it's starting to cause an issue. In an effort to handle this problem, because as they are becoming free, purchasing their own land, even though it's less fertile inland or as a tenant, they're still becoming competition to the planters. And so the planters became upset as these indentured servants are living longer, which means their businesses are going longer, becoming stronger, which means becoming more of a competition to the planters. So what the leaders of Virginia decided is they began to alter their society in ways to curtail and threaten the independence of these small freemen. And they decided to worsen the lot of the servant. And African slaves ended up becoming the largest ethnic group to come to British America during the colonial period. Before 1660, the slave population only formed a minority of the labor force. But by the 1660s, colonial legislative assemblies legalized lifelong slavery. And again, we'll talk about why 1660 is such an important transition from indentured servants to slaves next week. We'll talk about a big event occurs that causes Virginians to make this transition. And with this legalization of lifelong slavery, and you can see that little quote that was part of the Assembly's edict, be it therefore enacted and declared that all children born in this country shall be a bond or free only according to the condition of the mothers. And that decision to make the child become whatever the mother is also was a significant decision, and they didn't recognize the significance of the decision at the time, but it greatly impacted the social construction of labor in this country for the next 200 years. But the longer life expectancies coupled with the boom of tobacco and this event that occurred in 1660 that we'll talk about next week caused Virginia to move toward a system of labor that treated men as things. It dehumanized their laborers because they needed more out of them. So they started seeing them as pretty much like a livestock. One of the turning points that occurred, one of the significant events that occurred in the colonies that led to this transition from indentured servants to slaves was in 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon was a colonist in Virginia who had he came over as an indentured servant. He was granted his freedom. He started trying to purchase land, ran into the inability to purchase good, fertile land because the planters owned it all, or have to risk conflict with Native Americans to purchase land out there. And so because of this, the desire to acquire more land, he went to the governor of the colony, William Berkeley, and said, we need to push out the Native Americans. We're not able to expand our lands because they're in the way. So let's just push them all out. Let's just get rid of the Native Americans so that we can continue to grow as a colony and we can purchase more land. However, Berkeley at this time had a very lucrative monopoly in deerskin trade with the Indians, and he didn't want to risk cutting off that source of income and do something that didn't benefit him. So Berkeley said, no, we're not going to start a war with Native Americans. We're not going to try to push them out. You just kind of have to deal with it. And Bacon said, nope, sorry. I really want more land, and I've got a bunch of people in support of me who are going to take up arms with me. So what Bacon does is he ends up burning Jamestown and leading a revolt throughout the colony. He was able to, you can see the red where he took his campaign. He was able to march out pretty far west past the, settled area of Jamestown. But Berkeley was able to quickly regain control of the situation, and he punished all of those involved. Bacon ended up falling ill and dying a month after the revolt, but Berkeley set into motion some events that impacted the construction of labor in Virginia. One of the first things that occurred as a result of Bacon's Rebellion is that new lands were opened up to colonists to help relieve that pressure of the inavailability of lands. So good thing, more lands opened up, exactly what Bacon wanted. The second major result of Bacon's Rebellion is that planters began turning to slaves to work their lands rather than indentured servants, rather than Englishmen who, once freed, become competition for both these lands and revenue of tobacco being grown on those lands. So because of Bacon's Rebellion, elites deliberately transformed that class distinction between planters and servants/slaves into a racial distinction in order to prevent those white indentured servants aligning themselves with the black slaves. So the elites of Virginia, the planters of Virginia, instilled within indentured servants this understanding and notion of a racial distinction between themselves and slaves, and this racial hierarchy as you're automatically above a slave because of your skin color. And what this also does, this racialization, this understanding of a racial distinction rather than a class distinction, it ends up racializing the system of slavery and asserting the great planters as the rightful leaders of society. So Bacon's Rebellion is really what racializes slavery in North America. This is why slavery in North America and the repercussions of slavery in North America are so deeply embedded in North America as opposed to South America or elsewhere, Caribbean. Remember, prior to 1660, the slave population only formed a minority of the labor force, meaning the community of interest between the blacks and lower class whites posed no social problems. However, Bacon's Rebellion changed all that. Bacon's Rebellion was what the Virginia elites always feared, a servile rebellion that combined forces of slaves and indentured servants. So the answer to the problem, once again, was this institution of racism in order to separate the dangerous free whites from dangerous slaves through this screen of racial content. So this is where race really becomes recognizable and understandable in the minds of British colonists. And after Bacon's Rebellion, a new pattern of land acquisition emerges. There are fewer head rights issued. Remember, head right was you got 50 acres of land upon arrival plus 50 acres for every person, every servant you brought with them. Well, if you're no longer using servants but slaves, your number of head rights that you're issuing are going to go down. People aren't going to bring servants with them. They're going to come up over and then purchase slaves. So the number of servants coming from England drastically declined. And this allowed the planters to become the great planters that we know of today. Prior to this time, they did not own hundreds and hundreds of acres with what we understand with the concept of planter. They probably owned, 20 acres, 15 acres, that type of thing. Now that there's a decline of indentured servants coming over, they're able to amass these large plantations that we think of today. So this is when they started building their great estates. And you can see this is an actual map of the James River from the 1660s. And you can see how Anthony Jones has 500 acres and John Sparks has 750 acres. So you can see how these large plantations were now constructed. And as the number of poor white Virginians diminished, the traits of character that were attributed to Englishmen, to the indentured servants and slaves before, those labor characteristics, remember, they're shiftless, they're dishonest, they're disloyal, they don't want to work, they're lazy. All those concepts, characteristics that were applied to the lower class are now applied only to the slaves. Those traits have been racialized, whereas before it was based on a class hierarchy. And so the great planners attempted to squeeze out any class similarities between slaves and indentured servants by bringing these racial distinctions to light. And what it did is it guaranteed the expansion of an enslaved labor force, and it drove a wedge between the laboring whites and slaves. And race-based slavery entailed the dehumanization of an entire class of human beings. And this dehumanization was supported further by the scientific discoveries during the Enlightenment, which was going on during this time. What the Enlightenment period was a transition away from religious understanding of the world to a scientific understanding of the world. So all these scientists were going out and they were mapping out new species that they were discovering and trying to compare them to other species that are known in Europe to see if there's any type of similarities between the two. So these scientists did the same to peoples that they discovered, natives that they discovered in new lands that they were exploring. And they would map out the size of the skulls or the hands or the bodies of these new people and try to compare them to what they know in Europe. And what they did with Africans is they tried to compare them to primates back in Europe. And unfortunately, these quote-unquote scientific discoveries were not true scientific discoveries. They were not subjective. They had a particular goal in mind when making these comparisons, and that goal was to create this racial distinction between lower class whites and slaves. So all of these quote-unquote discoveries were tweaks of measurements, were tweaks of physical appearances to make them more similar to something animalistic. So after slavery has been transitioned into a racialized form of labor, it then transitioned over into the legal realm with the consolidation of slave codes in 1705. And what the slave codes did is they reinforced this developing racial system of justice in Virginia by denying Africans the civil rights that they had previously held that are now accorded only to whites. So prior to 1705, remember I said an indentured servant and a slave, if they did the same crime, stole a chicken, both the slave and the indentured servant would get the same punishment. The slave codes, the construction of the slave codes in 1705 changed that. So now the slave would have a harsher penalty rather than the indentured servant for doing the same crime, stealing a chicken, for example. So the slave codes created legal differences between whites and slaves for the first time. And slaves wouldn't be competition for free land, and less servants coming over meant less competition from whites. And this gave lower class whites an ability to claim more land in Virginia. So it actually worked to their benefit. This transition to slaves benefited the indentured servants that were already in Virginia because it meant less competition, less people becoming free. So Virginians converted to slavery simply by buying slaves instead of servants. That was the easiest transition of labor force you could do. We're just not going to purchase, we're not going to pay for more passages from England. We're just going to pay for more passages from Africa. And in 1700, enslaved Africans constituted only 11% of the total colonial population. By 1730, the black slave population in Virginia and Maryland had become the first in the Western Hemisphere to achieve self-sustaining rate of population growth. So they are now self-sustaining. They didn't have to keep purchasing more Africans to maintain this population. And by 1750, about 80% of the slaves in the Chesapeake region had been born there. They're native born. They had no other tie to Africa than their ancestry within one generation of converting to a slave-based labor force. So that's Virginia. We're going to talk a whole lot more about how the decisions on labor and handling slaves in Virginia impacted the rest of America and the colonies later. But now let's talk about some of the other colonies that were developing over the same time period. So Virginia was our joint stock company. Remember, for-profit, government did not interfere at all. Well, these are your triangle trade, so you can see where all the goods were coming and going, and your slave trade. You can see the vast majority of the slaves who did come from Africa went to the Caribbean and South America. Only 4% came to North America, and one of the major reasons for this is because it was self-sustaining. In the Caribbean and in particularly Brazil, it was not self-sustaining. They worked the slaves literally to death. Their life expectancy was not very long, so they had to keep bringing in more and more slaves to meet the demands of labor, whereas in the British colonies, it was self-sustaining. They didn't need to bring in as many. So now we're going to talk about other colonies. So Virginia was a joint stock, for-profit, private company. Maryland in 1634 became the first proprietary colony established in North America. And what a proprietary colony is, it's owned by one individual. It's not owned by a joint stock company. It's not managed and regulated by the monarchy. It's a dictatorship, pretty much. It's one person who owns the company, who decides how everything is going to go. And Maryland was owned by Lord Baltimore. And he sought to use the colony as a refuge for persecuted English Catholics. However, the majority of the indentured servants who came over to Maryland were Protestants. So they wanted it to be this refuge for Catholics, but then let's have all your labor force be Protestants. Unlike Virginia, however, Maryland did not struggle for years to reach economic viability. Maryland quickly prospered. They learned from what Virginia had to go through. They immediately started planting tobacco and producing that crop. This was one of those times where it became very beneficial to be number two, because you learned from all the problems that number one, Virginia, had to go through. Let's not send just men. Let's not be just dependent upon Native Americans. Let's go over there and immediately start planting tobacco. So Maryland was able to successfully thrive very quickly. Continuing up in New England, most of New England was made up of middle-class families. They paid their own way across the Atlantic, so they're not indentured servants being brought over. They're not just men coming over for exploration or adventure. They are families coming over. They're paying their own way, which means there's relatively few indentured servants in New England, and there's no planter elite in New England. So this makes it very different from Virginia and your southern colonies, because their social constructions are very, very different. There was also a cheapness of land in New England, and the low number of servants maintained an even distribution of wealth across New England, which means there was a narrow spectrum of social ranks. So pretty much everyone in New England was of the same class, whereas Virginia and your southern colonies, you're going to have the planter elite, and then everyone else, and then your slaves. There wasn't that in New England. There was a social equality pretty much. And settlers of New England were motivated by religious ideal. They weren't seeking adventure. They weren't seeking profit like they were in Virginia and your southern colonies. Another very important distinction between New England and your Virginia southern colonies. You had your family construction, your social equality, your class equality in New England, and then they're there for religious purposes, not for profit. And the majority of New Englanders were Puritans who were on this divine mission to create a model Christian society by enacting a code of laws and government structure based upon the biblical principles. So their government came straight out of the Bible. Their legal codes came straight out of the Bible. There was this marriage, a natural marriage in their mind between the church and state. There was absolutely no ability to divide the two. And their towns, the towns of New England, strove for unity and conformity, and they maintained discipline through the church. So if there was a crime that occurred, the criminal wasn't sent to a court for punishment. They were sent to the church, and it was the church that then decided what the punishment for the crime was. Like I said, there was this marriage between church and government. There was absolutely no way to divide the two in their minds. But because of this striving for unity and conformity, New England towns became very self-contained. Residents remained very close to town. They didn't go out and explore their lands very much. They stayed within the town boundaries. Very few newcomers were permitted into these towns, into these communities. Outsiders were seen as being very questionable. They didn't want any outsiders. They didn't want any diversity at all in their community. So they were very self-contained entities. Another colony, another area that we're going to cover is Plymouth. These settlers belonged to a radical sect of Puritans who, just as in New England, wanted to create their own godly congregations. And so they fled to initially Holland and then eventually America. They fled the king who wanted to get rid of the Puritans in New England and in England. He saw the Puritans as a threat to the Protestant England. So they fled persecution and came to America. They landed in 1620. About 100 men and women landed at Plymouth. And until 1691, they actually had no charter of government from any English authority. They were pretty much illegally staying on this land for 71 years. Finally, in 1691, they were able to get that permission. And their government, just as in New England, grew out of a covenant with the church. Now, what happened with Plymouth is it grew out of the Mayflower Compact, which is another branch, another arm of the covenant of the church. Thus, just as in New England, the civil government grew naturally out of the church government. This is a very prominent New England component of the characteristic of those colonies. And just as with the rest of New England, Plymouth also wanted to be this perfect colony, a model of godly devotion and moral rectitude. Civil disobedience was managed through the church rather than through a court system, just as the same as with New England. Plymouth and pretty much all of New England, rather than turning to the land, as in Virginia and your southern colonies, they didn't harvest crops. What they did is New England and Plymouth turned to the sea, and they started building shipping routes and shipping trade and doing fishing. That's where their main source of income came from, was shipping and trade and fishing. Fisheries encouraged the development of shipbuilding. So shipbuilding ended up becoming a very prominent portion of Plymouth and New England. And it spurred transatlantic commerce, because if you're big into shipping, you're going to have to do trade with someone on those ships. So Plymouth and New England maintained a very constant contact and business with Great Britain through the trade and the shipping. Another colony of importance is Massachusetts. And just as with Virginia, the Massachusetts Bay Company was a joint stock company. So privately owned, for-profit company that specifically came to America to seek profit. And the Massachusetts Bay the Massachusetts Bay Company was consisted of a group of English Puritans led by John Winthrop. So what the Massachusetts Bay does is it kind of marries the characteristics of New England and the characteristics of Virginia together. So it's a for-profit joint stock company, but it's got this religious component to it as well, being led by Puritans, being led by John Winthrop. And what Winthrop wanted to do was to create Massachusetts Bay Colony as a refuge for persecuted Puritans. So there's that further marriage of a religion with a for-profit company. So Massachusetts was intended to be this holy commonwealth. And so Winthrop formed these self-governing churches within Massachusetts. So unlike Virginia, Virginia was ruled from London, from the company owners, the joint stock owners back in London. Massachusetts wasn't like that. It was like the rest of New England, where it was ruled from self-governing churches. In order to be an active member in the government of Massachusetts, you had to be an active member of the Puritan Church of Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Bay Company considered the moral character and religious disposition of its servants to be almost as important as their occupational ability. So how devout you were was just as important as how well you could cook or how well you could clean or tend to some sort of livestock. There was equal weight between your religious disposition and your ability to work in Massachusetts. So in 1630, 700 Puritans sailed from Massachusetts. 200 died during the voyage, and this mass amount of death in this transatlantic voyage caused Winthrop to write a sermon while he was on board, proclaiming that these Puritans were a chosen people on a divine mission to create a city on a hill, a beacon for all the world, particularly Europe, to look to as this utopian society, these perfectly run society that's rooted in religion, that's just going to have absolutely no problems, because you never have any problems in utopian society, right? Utopian society is so easy to create. So Winthrop perceived that they were given this task to create a shining example to England of what a godly community could be. And so when they arrived in Massachusetts, he prized stability and order in order to maintain that godly community. And he hated democracy. He thought that democracy, the ability for everyone to have a say, destabilized the colony. It created chaos, too many cooks in the kitchen, if you will. And so he persecuted dissenters. He persecuted heretics. This picture depicts a man who was placed in the stocks for not obeying Puritan law. So when you're put in the stocks, either your hands or your feet were locked into this wood. And people of the colony could not come out and talk to you. They couldn't bring you food. They couldn't bring you water. They couldn't, be a company to you, a source of comfort. Everyone had to avoid you for however long you were placed in the stocks. And you could be there for days. And it was served as a physical punishment. And also through this peer pressure of, well, he is doing something wrong. We need to avoid him. And it places this stigma on you within the community. However, not everyone fell straight in line with what Winthrop believed. One of his main critics was Roger Williams. He criticized Winthrop's church-centered government because Williams believed that the purity of the church required a complete separation of church and state, and that there should be freedom from all coercion in matters of faith. He also believed that government should be impartial regarding religion. So whereas Winthrop believed there was this natural marriage between government and the church, Williams believed there had to be a distinction between the two in order to keep that purity of the faith, that purity of religion. So you can imagine how Winthrop reacted to Williams' critiques. He, welcomed him and gave him a hug and said, "Thank you for creating balance in my calling." No, what Winthrop did is he persecuted Williams, and he expelled him and his followers to England. If you're going to believe this, then just get out of my house. Like, it's my way or the highway type of thing. If you don't like it here, go back to England. So Williams and his followers and his family, with the threat of basically his life on the line, if you stay, you die, they fled Massachusetts, and they found shelter among the Indians. And Williams ends up establishing the town of Providence. He and his followers found this settlement, and it becomes the first permanent settlement in the colony of what becomes Rhode Island. So Williams, when he set up his colony in Rhode Island, he welcomed all who fled religious persecution in Massachusetts Bay. Hey, you don't like what Winthrop's doing. Hey, he punished you for just being you and trying to, not have a dictatorship here. That's okay. Come to us. We're welcoming of all. And Rhode Island was your truly only colony in North America that accepted any and all religions and any and all people. Everyone else had, yes, you can come to our colony if. And Roger Williams said, no, we will accept anyone. And in 1652, Rhode Island passed the first law in North America outlawing slavery. And this was 9 years before Virginia enacted perpetual slavery by children taking the condition of the mother. So it was a very timely decision to outlaw slavery, right when slavery is becoming the source of labor in Virginia. The last colony we're going to cover in detail before we jump down south is Pennsylvania. It was established in 1681. During the English Civil War, the Quaker sect was subject to intense persecution because they discarded all formal sacraments and practiced complete religious freedom for everyone, including, which meant that women could fully participate in religious affairs, which really ruffled the feathers of British Protestants. So William Penn founded Pennsylvania. And unlike Winthrop in Massachusetts, William Penn encouraged people of different religious affiliations to settle in his colony. He took the mindset of Roger Williams. Anyone and everyone is welcome. Please, our borders are open to you. So what Pennsylvania ends up becoming is it becomes the very first self-consciously plural society in America. It welcomed people of all different pasts. And his goal, Penn's goal, was to establish a holy experiment, a refuge where Western Europeans could live with minimal infringements upon their religious inclinations and enjoy the fundamental rights of English subjects. And what that means is you can practice whatever religion you want to practice. If you don't, we're not going to take attendance at this particular church. And in order to be part of government, you have to be at this church every Sunday. You have to participate in all these church meetings. We are going to focus on that. And if you don't, well, then you can't participate in government. Penn said no. If you want to go to the Protestant church, you can go to the Protestant church. If you want to go to the Puritan church, you can go to the Puritan church. If you want to go to the Quaker church, you can go there. Penn discouraged the unity between church and state. And in order to ensure that there wasn't this marriage between church and state, Penn drafted a series of constitutions that guaranteed religious freedom and promoted his colony both in Britain and other American colonies. So anyone who was not happy with the constraints placed upon them in Maryland or New York or Connecticut or even Virginia, they could come to Pennsylvania as a haven. And Penn emphasized the equality of all individuals before God, and he disputed the fact that religious conformity was essential to maintain a government. Rather, he said, there should be a balance of interest among the various churches. So this decision to create a government that was spread equally upon different religions is the true origins of American democracy. And as you can imagine, if you're welcoming anyone and everyone within your colonies, the relationships between the Pennsylvanians and the Indians were very good. The Quakers were very friendly, very respectful, and Penn created a careful policy of purchasing land titles from the Indians. He's the only one who did that, who purchased land from the Indians rather than just taking land from the Indians. So let's talk about more in depth about this relationship with Indians. If William Penn is the only one who made this policy of purchasing land titles, how were relationships with Indians elsewhere? And there was a very distinct difference between relationships of Native Americans with the British versus the Native American relationship with the French and Dutch. The merchants of the Netherlands and France wanted to work with the Indians to establish and exploit a profitable fur trade. So in order to do that, they built permanent trading outposts along the western frontier, and they established very friendly relationships with the Native Americans. So the British and the French saw the Native Americans as business partners, whereas the British sought to exploit the Indians. The British saw them as children to be parented or controlled and converted to Christianity rather than as business partners. The goal of the British was to subordinate rather than collaborate with the Native Americans. So very friendly, equal relationship between French and Native American, very unequal, controlled relationship between the British and Native American. And unfortunately or fortunately, there was the growth of these tensions and over who could do trade and have relationships with Native Americans led to a war, King Philip's War, that pitted Native Americans and the French against British troops. And the importance of this war is the financial impact it would have, the cost it would take to send more British troops to America to fight this war. and to protect the lands once the war was over. The financial component of King Philip's War will set into motion decisions that we'll talk about next week. But the reason King Philip's War came about was because of this lack of equality of relationship between the British and Native Americans. And as a result, Native Americans turned to the French, who saw them as equals. So lastly, let's talk about our southern colonies. We've talked about Virginia. We've talked about New England. The middle colonies are your New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. All four were proprietary colonies. All four remained loyal to the monarchy during the Civil War, the English Civil War. So now let's jump down to the south, where we've got Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Now, the Carolinas were established by 8 Lord Proprietors who recruited seasoned British planters from the Caribbean island of Barbados to replicate in South Carolina the profitable West Indian sugar plantation system based on the labor of enslaved Africans. So the Carolinas wanted to produce commercial crops, particularly sugar. Immediately, they were a slave-based labor force, and they brought all of their concepts and understandings from the Caribbean. Georgia is the last of the British continental colonies to be established as colonists continued to push southward. So Georgia wasn't established from people coming over from Britain and establishing the colony of Georgia. Georgia was established as people moved south who were already in America, but just moved south looking for fertile land and other places to expand. And as these British in America are moving down south, they brought their enslaved Africans with them and a desire to win the Indian trade from the Spanish who controlled Florida. So Georgia was set up as kind of a philanthropic experiment. We're going to see if this works as we move down south. And it was also set up as a military buffer against the Spanish in Florida. And in 1763, Georgia turned to the exportation of rice, indigo, lumber, beef, and pork, and it carried on a lively trade with the West Indies. So Georgia became very profitable pretty quickly. So we've got our colonies, and here's the map. You can see them broken up into the regions. You've got the southern colonies in yellow. You've got your middle colonies in New York. Remember the proprietary colonies, the 4 proprietary colonies who remain loyal to the monarchy: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. You've also got your New England colonies that we talked about. And then small area that becomes New Hampshire and part of New York a little bit later on. That's kind of disputed right now. But there's our colonies. And we've gone through, and there's very distinct differences between these regions of the colonies, the labor force of the colony, the South versus the Middle versus New England. The labor construction is very, very different. The construction of the people there are different. Which colonies were predominantly men established versus family established? Which of the colonies were more internally focused versus externally focused? So here are 2 charts that outline everything we've just gone over in a nice, simple chart. Because I will tell you, one of the questions on the midterm is, what are the differences between these colonies? Here's your answer. Excuse me. So you want to know when they're founded. You can see the order that they're founded. You can see who they were founded by. And when they became an actual colony. And then the right-hand chart goes more into the social, labor, economic differences between the three regions. Now that was a very micro look at it, the differences within the colonies within North America. Now let's do a larger look at it from the differences between the colonies in Europe. Was it worth the journey? Was it worth the danger of making that voyage across the Atlantic? Was it worth that complete upheaval of everything you know and comfort of Britain versus an unknown world in America? And the answer is yes. By the mid-17th century, American colonists on average were better fed, they were better clothed, and better housed than their counterparts in Europe, where majority of the people lived in destitution. The centralized control imposed by the monarchs in Spain and France hobbled innovation in Europe. It prevented entrepreneurship, it prevented exploration, it prevented discovery. You had to maintain the role that you were given upon birth, and you couldn't veer from that path. Whereas in America, it was an enterprise of English actors who were supported by private investment. They had minimum royal control over their actions and daily lives. So it's completely different. In Europe, you're very controlled by the monarchy or the church. In America, you're not, unless you live where? Unless you live in New England, where in order to be a part of the colony, you had to be a part of the church, and very highly monitored part of the church. Also, Spain and France were tightly controlled by the Catholic Church, whereas the English and Dutch welcomed people from a variety of nationalities and dissenting religious sects escaping persecution, except where? New England. But Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, your southern colonies, those were your more welcoming colonies for people of different religions escaping persecution. There was also a greater degree of self-government made in England, and it made the colonies more responsive to new circumstances. So they were able to react differently to circumstances than Europe was able to react because they were so self-contained. So yes, it was worth the journey. It was worth the danger. You might have ended up in a colony where you had to maintain a strict moral code and abide by a very strict law, or else. Or you could have moved to another colony with different rules and different labor sources. And once you're there, you could kind of go wherever you wanted. So that is how we went from pre-contact to a colonial society. Next week, we will cover, now that we are established colonies, how do we become one nation? How do we unite all these very different settlements? How do you unite someone who is like, I am strict Puritan, you must be a Puritan faith to be part of the government? How do you unite that person with someone who is from Pennsylvania who said, hey, they're kind of the hippies of the colonies. Anyone and everyone is welcome. You know, do what you want to do. We peace, love, everyone. Like, how do you unite those as one nation? And that's what we're going to cover next week. So thank you. Let's see if I can get you back onto my screen. Stop. There we go. So thank you for putting up with me on this lecture online, and I promise next week we'll be back in class. You'll see me in person, and like I said, we'll go over how we went from 13 very separate colonies to one nation, what events led up to that, how did we organize everyone as one, and if you have any questions about the syllabus, please either email me or ask me in class. You're probably not the only one with a question, so don't feel stupid asking it. The only stupid question is the one not asked. And if you have any questions about this lecture, please let me know. And I'll be happy to bring it up in class because, like I said, you're probably not the only one with that question. And then lastly, don't forget that your writing prompting quiz go live 8 p.m. on Wednesday. And you have until midnight on Tuesday to do both. Don't wait till the last minute, because if your quiz does crash or freezes or your computer power goes out or whatever, I can reset it. You have to email me and let me know, and I will reset it. But if you wait until 10 o'clock on Tuesday, 11 o'clock on Tuesday, I'm in bed. I can't reset the quiz for you. So don't wait till the last minute. Like I said, thank you, and I can't wait to see all of you in person.